But we're going to have
Oh,
Aziza
yeah, I saw your pictures.
Iskander is going to be on, and I printed 3 of these. So she's going to get one of them at least. And
Yeah,
you're a
that's
pretty good co-host when you come through. We can give you one for your house.
cool. Oh, that'd be amazing.
But you know, I have good news, and the reason why these happened was because, in fact, they're really durable. I'm holding these; they're pretty good card level. Oh, oh,
Yeah.
oh! I'm sorry. Did I say 3? I got all the cards, yo. These should be cards that should say, "I've got all the cards." So, but
That seems to
this
be
is
quite topical at the moment.
it's what we're going to talk about tonight, I'm sure. So, this is a photo of her mixed with her art. So,
That's cool.
and then also for our friends, I had to change the link to the next program because I'm switching to our broadcasting program instead of the telephones. But that's because I want to
We're
have us be able to,
upgrading.
have us be able to go through video and photos, and just
Yeah.
make it a little bit more multimedia, man.
Yeah.
So
We're getting our
we,
production. We're obviously getting a lot of interest now. We're getting our production levels good and
yeah,
proper now, which is
get
quite
it done,
interesting.
upgrade it, make it worthwhile for all of our friends who are joining us. And
We do
speaking of
get a
which,
few. I'll just tell you, we just had our last episode. We probably had about 60 people on. I mean, we've had anywhere between 60 and 150 people live.
yeah,
Through the week, I've personally been getting on my Substack to around 600 or 700 downloads, and then another 100, 150 downloads from Spotify, Apple Podcast, and then obviously another 300 or 400 on YouTube. It's totally it's sort of the 2,000-3,000 downloads for our little chats on a Friday, which is quite interesting. And that's not including yours.
yeah. On my end, I'm actually very thankful that they have pushed the account up to number 60 in Rising News,
Yeah, I saw.
and
Yeah.
we've been frequently toggling into that. And I think it's a combination of pretty good coverage of both the Ukraine situation and humans that we love and we get to live with, and then the American security problems, if you will, and the things that are
Yeah,
going on, and I think people have been wanting to see better commentary on this, and
I
I
think so.
I think the conversations have been really better than I would have expected. Great people, but I mean, I don't want to fail for everybody. So, but hey, we got a
We
new
haven't
bulldog
started yet.
shirt.
Anybody who's just come in, we haven't started yet. We're just waiting for a
We
few
got
more
our new
people to
bulldog
start.
shirt. What do you think?
Oh, that's cool.
Everyone likes the cat shirt, so I had to go get the bulldog
Yeah, I
shirt
had so
ready.
many people comment on that where you can get a cat shirt. I've got my power drink too, so we're going to be here for a while. So I've got
Coca-Cola, Smak Svobody. Anytime I'm
I got
offered a Pepsi, you get to hear my
Stella
response.
Artois, low calorie.
Hey, fancy, fancy.
Mm.
Yeah, so whenever they offer me a Pepsi, my response is always, "Please, that's Pepsi." So, fucking doing business with the Russian Federation is a deal breaker, yo.
Yeah, I've stopped eating Burger King because of that now. Not that you see many, but it's certainly illegal.
I don't remember the last time I saw Burger King.
Still in the UK, unfortunately. We're still waiting
that's
for
right.
contracts.
You have a king now.
Still waiting for my media accreditation so I can get my Ukrainian media accreditation so I can go do some
I got mine renewed. Number 7. It feels good, bro. It feels good. I'm getting to work until next year.
Yeah, that's good.
Just get it done. Get it out of the way.
I'm hoping I'll get back next week. So I've just been talking to Larissa, so hopefully we'll get back to Ukraine next week and I'll be back to normal.
We got some people joining in. So we talked a little bit about sort of some situations that are happening, and I guess we're right about the top of the hour. We can talk our way through the headlines first.
Yeah, I think so. There's
And
quite a few.
There's quite a few. Why don't we run with the first 2? You had one, I think that we'll go with that one, and then we'll come back to Dnipropetrovsk. I know how to say this. And what I call this week's Art of War update. In the 13 chapters, what did they fuck up this week?
I want to say, because we had someone complain that said, why are you so anti-effing Trump and all that lot? We're not anti-American. I love America.
I'm definitely not anti-American.
No, well, you're not. I mean, it's like I'm so not anti-American. I so want things to be done correctly, and they're not. And there's a hidden
Yeah.
agenda. So it's not that I'm anti-American, but somebody put on my Twitter today. They said basically I was instigating and supporting Iran, and I said I'm not sure how you come to that conclusion, but basically their argument was that because I'm complaining about the military, that I should just shut my mouth and carry on as normal, which for me was like, hold on, I am military. Hold on a minute, I'm not criticizing. I'm literally pointing out things, the unusual decisions that are being made that seem to benefit the fact that now, you touched on it, that sanctions are being lifted, which I predetermined a week before. I wrote about it, and I said this is now funding Iran's ally, who's just this week been told that they're supplying intelligence to Iran to target US positions, and now Trump's released sanctions on it, and now they're getting 150 million a day. Essentially, how many lives are going to be lost? How many Ukrainian lives are going to be lost? How many American service personnel lives are going to be lost because he's now relaxed the sanctions on Russia? So, of course, my hackles went up then. I was like, I actually got on well with him afterwards, but I was sort of saying, have you ever served? And he's like, I did a couple of years, like a long time ago, in the Navy. And I was like, I said, well, it's not a crime to criticize leadership. In fact, it will probably save lives because we were able to head this off and anticipate
That's the
this
whole
move.
fucking point. So let me run with that for a minute. You and I were having this conversation last week about the situation as it's unfolding between Trump and Iran, and I've said, we both would say it applies to Putin. And the thing that I was sparked to remember was that I had said back about Bush in Iraq that Sun Tzu warned against foreign incursions, foreign, and I don't want to say occupation because that doesn't necessarily apply with the every war concept, but the further you are from home, the more resources required, and there has to be a proportion between the campaign abroad and the stakes at home, or it will deteriorate. It's clear. So that's why I wrote that 9,800 word section, by each chapter of Sun Tzu's Art of War. And I said, look, let's take each chapter and apply it to Putin and then Trump and show how they're not fucking prepared. And then the worst case in the chapter 13 is Trump fired all the fucking spies. And I had this, I don't like to get in some historical figure's head like Sun Tzu, but he didn't have in the 5 types of spies, he didn't have a general who would have no fucking spies. That's not in his calculation. That a general will go, I think I'm going to launch a war. So the first thing I'm going to do is fire all the intelligence.
Well, you touched on it right there.
You know?
You've got an ally in Ukraine who's been fighting this very systems and these drones and this kind of warfare, which has now seen those same drones that came into Ukraine now over bases in the Middle East. Yet Trump's today said, we don't need Ukraine's help. I mean, you would have to be a lunatic not to use information, that would benefit and save the lives of American personnel. Clearly, he does. Clearly, they've been lying on the last press conference. Did you see, Pete Hegseth, who does his defense briefings like a post-match sports locker room interview? When they're asking about casualties, and he says, "No, the only thing the Iranians to see is the stars and stripes of our planes going overhead," and you just think, man, this guy's just solid, and I don't mean in the strength type. I mean absolutely brain dead solid. I mean, it's like
everything's like a brick.
He talks like a football player. And the only thing that's missing is like, goals win games. It's like that sort of thing. It's dreadful. And when they're asking about casualties, it's a really bad sign when the government says we're not going to talk about that. And you've already had 150, 2 planes down. Iran's now trying to take credit for taking down the refueling plane and the other plane. So, things aren't going, too well. Trump was saying that this, the straits were, in control, and he was in control of them while, oil tankers were burning up. And, it's just lie after lie. And that's where I step in and just say, as a former serviceman, as someone who trains American soldiers in survival now, because I go and talk about my experiences. I work with personnel recovery, and I try to talk to the military as much as possible, and the value of SERE training and the value of resistance training we're going to talk about later.
Yeah.
It's quite hurtful when somebody says you should just shut the fuck up, and you just go, what? Hold on a minute, what? I'm not some sort of guy that doesn't know what I'm talking about in a pub somewhere, in London, just sitting there going, those intellectual morons. And somebody that's lived here and done it. I live in the country. So, yeah, I mean, it's dreadful. You would naturally assume that the military would take some sort of training or some sort of leadership or understand the situation from drones, which clearly they haven't. Even to the fact that the Straits, they didn't expect them to blockade the Straits. So what else didn't they think about in this mad dash to attack Iran?
Well, that's chapter 1 of Sun Tzu. The best quote to come from that teaches us what chapter 1 is. He who has made many calculations before the battle will have more likelihood of winning. So, what were Putin's consequences in the last week? Ukraine recovered more territory than Russia seized, first time since 2023 counteroffensive. Ukraine reclaimed between 257 to 460 square kilometers since January 1st. Russia's monthly gain hit its lowest since July 2024. Russian casualties up to 35,000 per month now, including its new recruits, and the army has stopped growing. Putin's original calculations: 3 days war. Hollow Ukrainian state, but welcoming population. Oh, they had fucking uniforms in the BMPs, don't forget. And he's been wrong now for 1,479 days.
It's we've got them on the back foot.
Actually, let me correct myself. 4,404 days.
We've got them on the back foot. They're struggling, and Putin, as we said on numerous Friday chats, seems to always come to the rescue, and he's done it again. Putin's really struggling at home. He's cancelled the internet this week in Moscow. He's trying to reduce the size of his audience to the failure and the promises he made in 4 years ago. So what he's done is gone back to, as we said, the Soviet playbook. Have you tried turning it off and on? Because he's done is, collapse so much of the Western, social media, WhatsApp, Google, Telegram, because he wants control. He wants to know who's saying what and where. So, Russia's going back to the 80s, and for us old enough to remember that, we're seeing all the same things happen again with a regime that cut its teeth on, the Soviet times. It's going against the young, dynamic Ukrainian leadership who's in their 30s, 40s, and 50s, and the Russians are in their 60s, 70s, and 80s. So, they're going back to what they know. So they're actually going backwards. And what Trump's done essentially is give space for Putin, take the heat off Putin, now funding Putin, for 30 days. Who thinks that the sanctions will be back on in 30 days? I don't. I think he's got a 30-day waiver to allow the boats to get from sea to ports that are containing Russian oil. Do you honestly believe that he's going to put those sanctions back on?
No.
You can't trust Trump to do that. Putin's making 150 billion a day when he was struggling. He's struggling to make ends meet. So, he can now probably afford to offer those big contracts again and bring people in for money and things he was struggling because they were struggling to get those Manning up to speed because those they couldn't offer those sorts of that money anymore. It was unsustainable. So, it's really difficult to watch an America, an elite White House that seems to be, purring at the Kremlin, doing everything that they need to survive and prolong the war in Europe. And now, funding an ally of Iran, the very people they're meant to be at war with, who are targeting, giving them target information, And I think Trump today sort of said along the lines of, well, we're doing it. No, you're not, because you're funding Russia to kill American servicemen.
Right.
It's not like Russians are funding you to kill Russian servicemen. That's not happening. But that's what you're doing, Trump. I mean, it's the logic is hopefully I described that right. But the logic is just I can't believe where he goes with it and what he's doing, because it's just now, if Putin's making 150 million a day in oil revenues that he wasn't getting before, then you can bet your bottom dollar some of that's going to go to support Iran and kill Ukrainians and possibly US servicemen. So, if that isn't treason, I don't know what is.
Yeah, exactly. And the thing is that if you go down, I'll put the report out tomorrow after our program. But if you go through the again 13 segments of Sun Tzu's wisdom in the book, in every category, both Putin and Trump are making exactly the mistakes he warned about, and a lot of them had to do with something that you said at the very beginning, and was actually said with my interview today with Mikola Melnick, which will air next week. Going out to the front, so I have to I had to worry about more about other things right at the moment. But we'll put this interview out, and it's that you know loss of life is the first most important thing that happens in order to be mindful of and not capricious with. That was really what I think is the most misunderstood loss of people who don't relate to what Sun Tzu was saying to a king.
Mm.
Was you can't bring people back. So when you go launch them into war, it's kind of good to know what these calculations are before you expend the number one resource of the state, human beings. And how many people have now been killed and injured under Trump's failed operation already, in just
Well,
a
it's
couple of weeks?
downgraded already. Have you
Yeah.
noticed? Initially
Yeah.
it was regime change. Then it was I want control of the regime and who's in place next. All they
Yeah.
did was
Tomorrow will
kill
be called a special operation.
Halamani and put another Halamani in it. I mean, that's all they've done and spent billions on that to just replace one with another. Apparently, he's now injured. We gave him a week, but now he's meant to be injured, but he's still alive. But this is a fanatical regime. This isn't a Russia. This is guys that will die for what they believe in. We touched on it before, the Shaheed culture. These
Right.
guys think nothing about losing their life for 75 virgins and a Dr. Pepper. They're just literally will do that. So, they know how to fight this war. They know that if they keep flinging missiles out to Dubai, keep flinging missiles out to Jordan and Bahrain, eventually they'll hit the refineries because they're ill prepared.
Hmm.
They know what they're doing globally with the markets and closing off the straits. And that is something if you're going to do something that Trump's done, you would have
Hmm.
had that gamed out,
Right.
talked about. But right from the off, they're chasing the drones. They're chasing the ballistic problem. They're firing 800 Patriots after a country's been at war doing this for 4 years. And now they're struggling because they didn't anticipate the straits would be blocked or mined or closed off. So,
How could they not?
everything that they're chasing the tail straight from what should be them having the offensive. And now
Hmm.
Putin's lying his ass off. Now he's funding Russia. I mean, it's bizarre. The more I even talk about, the more angry I get. So
Sure.
definitely what you're saying is absolutely correct. Now, the art of war hasn't changed. It's still fundamentally, even the advance and the innovations of drones over the last 4 years,
Right.
those still relevant things, before you go into battle.
Yeah, and Sun Tzu's era had several ways of describing warfare that were based in contemporary weaponry, swords, use of fire,
Yeah.
catch fire to the logistical line. And now, if you just adapt it more metaphorical, yes, it won't be swords that are worn down, but your weapons will be worn down. The burden of carrying them is twice as hard. The longer it goes on the slog of human beings that are carrying the battle, men and women, physically carrying the battle. He warned about that, and I think Ukraine is mindful of this when you
Yeah.
see the
The
efforts
cost of
happening
living
here.
in
Cost of
many
living, and,
ways.
and also the ways in which there's a lot of backbending to try to offset the burdens that are put on people who do the service.
Mm.
And you don't see that in Putin's arsenal of get the go I don't even say mobilize, but basically conscripted mobilization in Russia. What is the incentive if you're not defending your homeland? You don't have gold at the end of the rainbow. X amount of rubles for what? So then let's go to Trump and Iran. What is even more the benefit of doing it in that category? It's reduce and reduce and reduce. This is the thing. Now, what were there was a when we were talking on the phone, there were other headlines that you said you thought were more
Well, I mean, I
significant.
think along the lines of I think this is going to be a problem 10 years after this war's finished. I think America's going to have a problem because any country with an American base now in that region is really going to get hit.
Hmm.
I believe we talked also about how Americans were now, or the Trump administration is now making war fun, which was something I
Yeah,
was shocked, to be
yeah,
honest, that now they were pushing this out. It strikes us an administration that doesn't seem to have any academics. Like you said, they don't really use the diplomatic corps, which is bizarre. They don't really use people that are trained or experts in the Middle East or Russia anymore. I dare say
right.
they have a strategy, but who's pushing that strategy? Is it Hegseth? My God, the
Yeah,
guy is just I mean, I can't think he's got a strategic brain in his head, to be fair. And that's not being cool. But he says things. I'll put you an example. When he says things like, yeah, it's, stars and stripes in the sky, that's all they ever see. We're going to bomb them, bomb them, bomb. That's what privates say. That's what large
right,
corporals say. That's not someone who's in a defense meeting
right.
talking about one of them, a serious major conflict. That's what non NCOs say, not officers. So it's extremely embarrassing at the moment for I don't even think they know how stupid they're looking or embarrassing they are. And this, if I was an American soldier, if I was an American, I'd be thinking, Jesus, I'm gonna fight for these clowns.
Right.
It's just there doesn't seem. I'm sure there's a strategy somewhere, but whoever's in charge of it, Trump will eventually. He's not one. He will push. Look at Naomi. He'll push people under the bus if he thinks it's going to affect
Yeah.
him. He'll do exactly. He copies Putin to a T. He will throw people under the
He'd
bus
throw
if it
that. He
means.
would throw that robotic Slovenian woman under the bus in a heartbeat to save his own ass.
Oh, he would, yeah. So
Yeah.
it's absolutely disgusting. So yeah, I mean that's where we were at with this week. I mean, I think that's probably the major news this week
Yeah.
is the fact that the sanctions now have been lifted on Russia. Now, essentially, Trump's administration is funding the very people that are killing, targeting and killing U.S. service personnel, which is deeply unsettling.
Exactly. That's exactly it. And before we get to our main topic tonight, um, there are areas where Russia keeps showing its real objectives by switching away from its kinetic warfare back to hybrid warfare, playing around in elections. And
Mm.
Hungary is the least easy thing to like hide and figure out. Oh, Orban's running to Kremlin in broad daylight and attacking Ukraine, broad daylight in the stupidest ways, and then Slovakia, same thing. But there are other cases that I didn't get to finish the 29155 article this week. I've got too many little, shall we say, fun segments inside of it that require good research. But you can see for a while, there are several GRU units being used to directly attack throughout Europe and America. And the last thing is that America's vulnerability for drone attack is still unknown, and largely because a failure of imagination by local officials and by civilians, even the resistance. I told you earlier on the phone that I watched a video that thought it was so smart because, Trump, you can't believe him. Therefore, why would there be an
Mm.
attack in Los Angeles? And it's like, wait a minute, you're not thinking in terms of what we see here all the time, how they launch drones. They don't just launch them from Belarus side or
No.
Bryansk side. They come from multiple locations and they're looking for a vulnerability.
Mm.
What happens when you have China as an ally instead of Europe? Why would you fly a drone in a boat out of Europe to try to attack from the eastern side when you could leave China or Central America, somewhere on the western side. And I know it won't be that easy. Hold on, get here, read my ear. And so I just think that people need to recognize that if you think of Operation Cobweb or Spiderweb and how it emerged and out, went some planes, it's just as easy to imagine that agents against the United States could do that within America by just
Oh yeah, you can
doing
imagine
the
all
same thing
ISIS
that
people
that
like that
plotted
taking
9/11.
notes.
Yeah,
Bloody hell! Look what they just did.
yeah,
Straight in. And that's got all the security services in in our home countries really working overtime now to
right.
try and combat this. Already with Russia now having to deal with Iran because of this.
Yeah.
And then it gets what are the goals? Like I touched on earlier,
When you kill
those
the Khomeini's son and his name becomes Khomeini, it seems like you're not making much progress.
not really. And the more they keep telling him it's under control, we're bombing them, the more anybody that's in that region knows that, there's not enough troops, American troops, to go in to take a ground. So, the major objectives have already been downgraded in the first 2 weeks. So, Trump's failed in his initial plan, and now, where it goes, nobody knows at the moment. You're back into probably a 3, 4, 6 month war now.
Yeah,
Because they've started something. And you got to remember, Trump got elected on a no war policy. You're an American, he got elected and no more wars. And so far, he's promoting them, prolonging them, and starting new ones. So I think come November, I don't fancy his chances in the midterms now that the gas price is going up quicker than a stopwatch.
right.
It's like crazy, isn't it now? So
I'm
excuse
sending
me.
a link to Lenny, who was on earlier this on Tuesday night, and she had been hold on, let me spell the word.
Lisa, you're right. What a
There we go.
weird paradox we are in right now.
And so
Unbelievable.
we had talked about her time in captivity, and you and I had talked last week that we should talk to this audience about that. We have 35 people here now. Um, let me say you're in charge on this in a big capacity of saying what do you think the audience needs to know most to walk away with at the end of this discussion, so that when they start they say, okay, I'm prepared to learn and be useful tonight.
I think you could take what we're going to talk about now into everyday life. I mean, it's a lot to do with training you do, how you handle things, the way you look at life.
Right,
Certainly, you can take that into some people that might be listening to us, maybe actually going through some really bad things at the moment. But when you start hearing some techniques really on how to deal with some really intense, stressful situations, I don't think I've ever really talked in depth about it. People that have read the book will have a glimpse of it.
right,
But we can talk about, there's nothing off record. So I talk about this for a living now. So it's not,
right.
I've repeated it a million times. I get upset at the right times. Those are the right times when you're talking about that, you do get upset sometimes. But I think it's really interesting what people, I'm interested in people's views when they come away and what they take away from it. Because everyone's different, aren't they? It's,
Hmm.
but essentially, I mean, let's start with the fact that I don't think you can train for this. For those that don't know, I am SERE trained, which is
Hmm.
survival, evade, resistance, escape trained, and I was trained by the Americans in America. So I'd had some resistance training, but I think even with all that, 9 years in the British military, I don't think you really know how you're going to handle these things until it happens.
Hmm.
So there is an element of that. But when I sort of explained to you the one, let's start with the fact that I'd had 9 years in the British military. I'm 52 now. I was like in my late 40s when I was captured.
Hmm.
I'd had 4 or 5 years in the Ukrainian military before I was captured. I understood what had happened and served with other people that had been captured.
Hmm.
I'd learned a language. I'd lived in Mariupol. My family were in Mariupol. So I wasn't someone who it was a surprise. I wasn't young. I'd been to Bosnia, Northern Ireland, had a good military career, lived in the country for a long period of time. So it wasn't alien. And part of me, I think my character was that, if this happened, I knew exactly what to do. I'd been trained different stages. You can't train for pain, but we'll break it down in a minute. But, you can't train for that. But I had a good knowledge of what I had to do to survive before I was captured. And then the rest is obviously people know. So what we're going to talk about tonight is the nitty gritty, the stages of capture, what happens when you're captured. And then you can probably take that away tomorrow or Monday when you go back to work and then say, hold on a minute, things ain't that bad, especially when you sort of know the nitty gritties. The nitty gritties.
Yeah. And I think that having what's called basically stress inoculation, where you get at least a dose of what it could be. Also, it's in friendly confines. They're not there to kill you, but they're there to give you a sense of what could happen so you're not caught cold. And for those who don't know, a lot of those lessons came from those that were broken in World War I and World War II. And they found that the ones who butched up the most, I can't be broken, were the ones who broke.
Yeah, for sure.
So a lot of lessons were learned the hard way, and a lot of research in order to get to that point. And then, of course, we reverse engineered it in the Bush Cheney administration. I hate to use that phrase, reverse engineer, but basically, Mitchell and Jessen took what they thought was a manual to torture and tortured people, thinking it was going to extract information. And in fact, it validated what was wrong with the totalitarian model, which is it's just forced confession.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If your line of questioning is, have you seen Elvis? By the time you finish, you'll go, Elvis is your dad. You're going to go, yeah, Elvis is my dad. That's the thing. But we'll go. I want to go and touch more on that as we go through. So let me start with.
Take it.
So we've got to fast forward to the points where. So when I went to SERE, explain just a bit about SERE before we go into that. SERE is survival training. So the survival element was knocked on the head because modern day warfare, you're expected to get to people that down pilots within 2 hours. So a lot of the budget cuts that came in, the survival element of SERE was actually knocked on the head, which is why I talk now with SERE School, saying I was in a 200 kilometer encirclement, which meant that nobody was going to get to me. This isn't the Taliban. This is the Russian military who's got air superiority and a substantial force. So part of what I do is go back now and talk to SERE schools about that. That element is about catching food and where to get water and how to survive when you're evading the enemy. And then you've got the evading part, which teaches you how to really prepare for the evasion. Just to not be captured, how to track, use a compass, find your way back to friendly lines. It's a bit more in depth now. I'm just paraphrasing because we don't have too much time. So then we're looking at so we've gone SERE, survival, evade, resist. All right, that's the bit about what it's like to be captured, interrogated, used for propaganda, how to really be a diplomat, not give everything up in one go, make them fight for it, a bit about how prisons work, how to get out of cuffs comes later when we do the escape bit. So we're looking at the best chances of escape. When to escape, putting the escape plans together. So that's basically in a nutshell how SERE works over the sort of 6 weeks we did it. What we got is that by the time Mariupol fell in April, around sort of April, I was captured about 2 hours outside of Mariupol. And anyone that knows anything about captivity, the initial capture is the most dangerous. So you've just been out of firefights. You're on the front line. You could have quite feasibly killed some of their friends, and unpredictability is the real problem at that stage. If you've surrendered, that's slightly different. But if you're captured, then that unpredictability level comes up. And I tried to get out of Mariupol. So once I'd negotiated, once they cornered me and I negotiated my time, I had to do that 30-meter stretch into the death walk. I managed to get rid of all my tactical information on my phone. But once you do that, once you get into that initial phase, you're then fighting a different war from that point.
Wow.
You're literally then your war as a soldier is changed to a new war where you're now surviving. Your war's over, essentially. It's about self-preservation and keeping survival. So that's essentially where my time in captivity started at that point. Once you'd made that, so once you've walked towards them and you're there, and then you're bound and hooded, that's where your whole transformation starts. Essentially, you're not even a prisoner of war at that point.
Right.
So, essentially you should be, but as I'm going to explain, the Russians don't look at it like that.
Right. And did you know, or have you looked at some of the differences between how they do that with civilians? Because my understanding from more than one interview in this situation is, at least in that capacity, they're the same.
In my experience, they are exactly the same. Initially, I was taken to a command post about 15 minutes from the front lines into their rear. And then I wasn't captured, I was mugged. So like I'd walk in, and this guy who looked more scared than me with his eyes like this, and he had real young, he had didn't even have a proper, he had bum fluff. He was quite young. And there's a popular English program called The In-Betweeners, which is about a group of young kids.
Sure.
Not everybody heard them, but it's about young kids that just left school, and and I was captured. I refer to it, but I was captured by the In-Betweeners, which is sort of slightly knocked my confidence a bit. But generally they were okay. But they were just, I'd feel my cargo belt slide off, my watch slide off. Suddenly my fleece had gone. I was standing there in an underfleece, like an under top and a t-shirt. Next thing you know, my cap had been taken, and then I was hooded, and then things were being taken out of my pockets. And then suddenly I'm taken into a car, taken back to a command post where somebody lifts up the hood to check against my army ID, and a big guy behind him just slots you straight in the mouth. And that's your sort of wake-up call to the fact that you're then a prisoner, really. And the tactical question you get trained on when you're in the military didn't materialize. It was very loose, chaotic, which told me that they didn't seem to be professional soldiers, which then I learned they were Donetsk People's Republic militia. They look visibly different. From then, your optics, you're heightened to look at everything because you can't see because you've got a hood on 90% of the time. So I was really quick to work out that generally people with shiny boots and shiny combats and shiny fatigues were actually quite structured. They're clearly not fighting on the front lines. I had a better chance of survival with people with clean boots and on a clean floor in a clean environment because somebody was in charge. They obviously had pride, discipline, structure, and you can get that just with looking through the bottom of the hood, which is really you can get a lot of intelligence about what you're dealing with. At that point, you're dealing with lots of muddy boots, lots of muddy combats. You're dealing with a lot of aggression. You are taken to a room in a basement initially down at the bottom of a house where once you get in there, you can remove your hood. But in there are like 7 other Ukrainians in a basement, a freezing basement. Some of those guys looked like they'd been in there for weeks. They were skeletal. It was horrendous, up to your knees in rubbish. It stank. It was -5, 6, probably -10. I don't really know, but it was freezing. And I was only in limited clothes because they'd stolen everything off me. So when I got put out, I was only in there for a short time. Before then, I was taken out. And then straight away, already I could see Russian fatigues. Either FSB or some military police units were there. And then suddenly my whole world changed. These guys, one of them could speak English. They were immaculate. You could tell they were different to the DPR because they're different tape. They had really good gear, fast helmets, ear mics, microphones, multi-tools, things that the DPR didn't have, the Donetsk People's Republic militia. So straight away they started questioning. I thought these were a different breed. And then suddenly this guy comes out and just stabs me in the leg with a knife. And I'm buckling up on the floor, screaming, and then they get a t-shirt, literally plug my leg up, 3-inch knife wound in my leg, and then put sellotape around the t-shirt and then take me to a room which I called the tiled floor room, where they through my hood. When I was in Bosnia, we used to go through some serious security training. And when we were sitting there through the security training, the guy instructor would say, if you find yourself in this house, said, the chances of you getting out are going to be pretty slim. I was now in this house, and I'm already thinking, where the fuck am I? Bleeding out, beaten to a pulp, put in this chair, sellotape to this chair. And when I was sellotaped to this chair, I could look down through my hood and see this tiled floor with a circular drainage where I thought that's where the brains and the blood go. That's a quick, easy clean there. So I was sitting there thinking, that's it. If I'm going to die, I'm going to die. There's nothing I can do about this. And then they stuck 2 paddles onto my fingers. And I apologize. I do have some humor in this because, one, it's a grim subject, and I don't want everybody to think that, that there isn't. And I'll come on to the humor, but this bit isn't very nice. So I'm just warning you. So they have put paddles onto your little fingers. And next, you know what that is straight away. You know you're going to be electrocuted. The next thing you know, there's like tick, 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 tick. And then you're just standing up in the chair they've tied you to because everything's locked up. And this is like really strong voltage, enough that, it seems like minutes, but it's probably 20 seconds. And when you come down, everything just relaxes and everything just like you're dribbling and you can't make head nor tail of anything. And then you're just sitting there and they're asking you questions. You're SAS. You go, no. Are you special forces? You're James. But no, I'm like, you've had my military ID. You've had my stuff. So they're literally next about electric, tick, 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 you're up again, and there's nothing you could do about it. And people quite often say, what's being electric, what's being tortured like? I said, it's exceptionally quiet. It's not like the movies. It's not like people screaming. First of all, you can't scream because everything's locked shut. It's that, well, you can't do anything. Normally you look around, if you can open your eyes, you're not closed, you can look around, everyone's just gawping at you because they're just looking at you getting electrocuted. So, there's not much they can do. And then, secondly, nobody's going to touch you because you're being electrocuted. So, generally, it's just silent. All you can hear is the dick, dick, dick. You just got to get through it. And that's it. And you go through 3 or 4 bouts of that with some pretty random questioning with people checking on laptops to make sure who you are and your social media profile. And you're going through that. And by the end of it, you just can't, you just slumped in a chair. You can't do anything. And then they're dragging you out, which I could hear people saying you're going to be moved to somewhere else. So I was bleeding out, just been electrocuted about 3 or 4 times, and then dumped in the car where I was bleeding all in this nice new car of theirs. And I was thinking, well, if I'm going to go, at least I'm just bleeding out in the back of their nice shiny car. Someone's got to clean that shit up. So, I started to already hear that in Russian that somebody wanted me in Donetsk, that somebody was interested in seeing me. And having my training where I fell back on, I knew at some point I would, I've met bad cop. At some point, I'm going to meet somebody and go, hello, Mr. Pinner. You can rely on me. I'm now your friend, And that was, my training was something like 30 years ago. And that hadn't changed. I knew that was coming. In SERE training, they teach you to try and escape through the travel between A to B. Because actually escaping once you get to B is extremely hard because guard numbers change, the levels manning change, you're in a prison within a prison. Eventually you can't get out. So the only chance you can get away is between A and B. They know that. So I literally had a guy to my left, my head put in his lap, a guy in the front, and a guy in the driving. 3 guys following me everywhere. I was never getting out. Plus, they'd stabbed me in the leg to stop me from running away in the first place, which told me they were decently trained or knew that I was possibly going to run away, or, you know, when I was going to run away. I couldn't go anywhere because I was hamstrung, technically. So already I had to just sit there for 2 hours dribbling through you know, while I was trying to get my conscience. I actually fell asleep in the back of the car for a bit. And then the guy said to me, "Are you okay?" And I was like, "No."
Fuck me, man.
Humor. I was like, "No." And he went, "Do you want some water?" And suddenly something started to change. You know, suddenly I was thinking, they were telling me that they were going to sell me to some Chechens. That, you know, some things didn't add up. Nothing I was taught added up. So they were like, "We're going to sell you to some Chechens." I said, "I'm just curious how much they'd pay for me." And he went, "Oh, no, we're getting $1 million for you." And I was like, "I'd pay $1 million for a late 40s Englishman who's just spent the last 4 years earning $400 a month in a prison home. This is not going to happen."
Right.
So I was already starting to think, hold on a minute, if they wanted me dead, then they would have killed me back there. Somebody wants me alive. So already I started to think we had some value. And that's your first little victory. If you're going through some hard times, in life, find those little victories that you can work on to get your morale up, where you can get some sort of control. For me, my first victory and my turning point was essentially when he just sort of started telling me lies. And then he told me that a Russian general had been captured. Already then I started to think, I've got some value. He said, "We'll get 10 for you." You know, all the way over like 4 hours. You know when someone's lying because they can't remember the lie they just told you. You're remembering everything because it's your life on the line. So, you know, from the start of the cover where we sold you to some Chechens to telling me that after a 4-hour journey to Donetsk, you know, suddenly the people could get 10 for us, 10 for me, 10 people for me. So I was naturally already, by the time I'd got to this, thinking, well, that whole trip, that journey had given me a lot of hope. Something we don't talk about in the military very often, because if you rely upon hope, which is something I put on about the Trump administration in Iran at the moment, you listen to how many times that the press secretary, our press secretary, and people use the word hope. You wouldn't use it in the military, because if you're using hope, you rely upon hope, you haven't planned well enough. You haven't got a backup plan. So when you hear people talk about hope,
it's an ephemeral term that has no landing on the ground, you know. So then you're out in the field and there's nothing to grasp at that's a thing.
No, you're reliable because everything's gone to shit. So the last thing you rely upon is hope.
Right.
So when you hear politicians, to everyone who's watching, when you hear them talk about hope, it means generally things have gone to shit. So except, I would argue, when you're in a prison environment, because when you've had dehumanized, stripped, and everything taken from you, then sometimes hope is all the only thing you've got left. So you have to work those angles to get a small victory. And that could be anything. You know, a small victory could just be not beaten up as much as you thought you were going to get beaten up. You know, you've got to hold on to that.
Is another small victory making them work harder, like certain ways in which exhausting their patience, you know?
In my case, I didn't have to do much of that. I had actually, our position got folded. We were told from the highest levels to either surrender or try and get back to friendly lines. The battlefield, by the time I'd captured and got to Donetsk, had changed so considerably. Really, anybody I knew and all the positions I knew, they were scattered to the four winds because they'd got the order to abandon position, and it's every man for himself. So I wasn't really much I could give them. So it was about delaying information. I wasn't going to sell out my friends. I was going to give them enough time to go. So when they asked me things like, "How many of you were there?" I was like, "Well, you just caught me. I've lost my platoon. There's nothing I can do about that." One of the things that I tell people now is don't tell people you're a chef or a medic, because every prisoner doesn't want to be the one that's captured pulling the trigger. And if you say you're a chef or medic, you're just joining another 500 chefs or medics. So, you might as well
just a truck driver.
Cover story that's close to the truth that you can remember, that doesn't look like you're lying. And, and when they ask you, because one of the things was one of my colleagues who was captured told him I was a chef. because I did a lot of cooking for my team and stuff because they like my food. So when they questioned me, they asked me how do I cook kasha, which is, for those who don't know, is like porridge. So I had to describe one of my interviews just to make sure I was, I had to talk about how I cooked kasha and what I put in with kasha. And that was one of my interrogations. I mean, it was so random, some of the interrogations I had, and it was farcical. I said to you before, I had one where they didn't know how British papers work. So I gave a 45-minute lesson on which papers were the ones that you really should be interested in if you want to get your story out. Who owned those papers? Which political affiliation were those papers? That was one of my. And I came down and saw one of my cellmates. He went, "How did that go?" And I went, "I just done a media lesson."
Right.
In my interrogation, it was like farcical. But then other interrogations, I'd be pulled out and they just went, "You didn't tell us everything, Shaun." And I was like, "What?" And they said, "You didn't tell us you were an instructor with Azov." Then they put a hood on me, sellotape the hood, which you knew you'd really messed up when they do that. So you're like, you can't move, you can't breathe, and you've got a hood. And then they tie you to the chair again, and then stick electrodes on your ear and electrocute you on the ear. And that is, look, I got goosebumps because that is really not so intense, but it's sharp and it gives you such a migraine. And by that time, I'd been electrocuted so many times. My legs were like the size of elephants' legs. They'd inflated really big. I could barely walk. And I had capillaries bleeding where they would electrocute me so much, the capillaries started to burst in my legs and were bleeding down my leg. So that's how bad and intense those electric shocks are. What the long-term health is of those, I don't particularly know. But you can't train for pain. I mean, it's extremely painful, and I'm not going to kid you. I didn't sit there going, "Come on," I'm like Rambo. I was in a bad way, but there's nothing you could do about it. And I was just taken back to my cell again, and they stopped all my food rations. So literally, because I didn't tell them I was an Azov instructor and a sniper for 2 years, they literally said, "We're not going to give you any food," and they didn't. We got an occasional bit of bread just to keep me alive. And starvation then is possibly the worst torture, to be fair. You can mitigate for the pain. You could get stabbed in the leg, it's over pretty quickly. They did stitch up my wound and give me an injection, which I don't know what has knocked me completely out. I didn't want the injection because I knew they drugged you. They drugged some people and took compromising pictures of them while they were asleep, made them sign paperwork while they were unconscious. So it was very difficult to, you can't really say no. So next thing I know, I got a needle in my neck and I was out cold. And when I came round, they'd stitched my leg up. I don't know what they did to it or anything like that. I was just so tired. I was that tired. We had a 1 meter by 3 meter isolation cell I was in, which is against the Geneva Conventions. It was pretty new. It looked like it'd just been built. It smelt new. The chains were new. The paint was new. It's got no window in there. The light's on 24/7. You're literally woken up and put to bed by a buzzer. So you don't actually see anybody. You're just in there, and you've got to go to bed. And I was that tired that first night I was captured. There's a steel metal plate on the front of the door. I didn't hear anybody come in. And the first morning I was there, they came in with this food, and it was beautiful. I'd eaten 7 weeks fighting in Mariupol. I was already emaciated, skinny. I was looking all right, but first bit of food I had, and I thought, "Sod it, I've got to eat it." First rule in SERE is they teach you to eat whatever food's presented to you to keep your sustenance and calories up, because you're burning 1,500 calories static, easy. I don't know what the going rate is. You're probably getting, well, certainly at that point I wasn't getting anything. By the time I'd had half a loaf of bread, we worked out probably I was getting about 500 calories a day. So I was already on a calorie deficit, just doing nothing because of the food. But this food was amazing. But because I didn't tell them I was in Azov, which they did it when I found out afterwards, they did it to everyone anyway. They give them the first plate of food. They give you like a nice meal. Then they give you a lunch meal, and you think, oh, well, prison isn't that bad. And then they stop it the next day. This is what you could have had. And already I was going down and going, no, they do that to everybody, you know. So then you've had your meal, you get everything through you, and then suddenly you're down in like a black site, which is, for those that don't know, is a prison you don't really know where it is. It's underground. So for the next 60 days, I was then pulled out for propaganda, electrocuted on the ears, told if I didn't do, if I wasn't, all their angling the questions was in front of cameras, and they would come out and say things like, so did you bring the weapons in from UK yourself? I go, you have to be really smart to go, do you know what the gun laws are like in the UK? I've been living here. I'm married to Ukrainian. You know, I've lived here for 4 years. I haven't been home in 5 years. So no, you know, and you'd start to tell the truth. And deep down somewhere through those first several days, they're trying to ascertain how valuable are you and who you are. So you don't really, otherwise, because if they think you're someone of high value, they're going to send you into Russia and you'll meet some more professional interrogators, real nasty guys. So you're sort of trying to battle delaying information, like you said. You're trying to battle with delaying information, giving them a bit, but eventually, you know, you just want the pain to stop. Eventually, you can't hold it. Everybody eventually gives.
And what about, this is something that's a very, very common theme, and I know we've probably addressed it for sure. What I call the Superman complex. Not that the person who's in it, feels that they're Superman or superhero per se, but you feel invulnerable when it's you, and then when they do it to your buddy, do it to another person from the unit, then you find out like what your tolerance can be. And I don't know a single defender that I've talked to, and in many civilians no less, but especially the defenders who said once I'd found my threshold, they started doing it to another guy. And they went, now do you want to talk? That's your buddy.
Yeah. They killed Paul Urey, British NGO worker, while I was in captivity, unfortunately. He was beaten so badly. And there's two sides to this, really. One is I never liked anybody else getting beaten up. John Harding was a British medic worker with Azov who was in the next cell, who really did get hard beaten. They cracked his sternum. They beat him so badly in the prison that he was coughing. I never thought he'd make it out. He had pneumonia at one point. He was really struggling. You know, at one point, I just didn't think he was going to get out. And then Paul Urey was beaten on a trip to the prosecutor's office so badly he died of his injuries 2 days later. And then you can't just walk out and go and see a doctor. You know, it's like they're so undertrained and they're on probably less than minimum wage, and these guys in the black site are chosen by character. So they, you know, if he says beat you up, he'll beat you up. You know, or he goes to the front. So you know, these guys are normally quite big or seasoned soldiers that are past their sell-by date who are got a life with the Ministry of Interior in Donetsk People's Republic who make their life out of just beating civilians. I was in a prison with a civilian, a 19-year-old train driver who, you know, wasn't even in the military. He was getting the same hard time I was. And there were women in the prison too. I didn't see him, but Brahim, who eventually got moved to my cell, told me he'd met a couple of women at the top, seen a couple of women. But the Superman complex is twofold, really. Paul Urey, for all his sins, I would have never wanted him to die there, but he's a pretty difficult guy to get on with, who tried to befriend the Russians that pissed him off. He didn't speak any Russian. He tried to portray himself as a gangster hard man. He had tattoos. It was anything but, and ended up really pissing off so much. He got beaten so badly and ended up dying of his injuries 2 days later. But he's someone that really didn't understand the situation he was in. Totally the opposite to me, who'd been trained and worked in the military, lived in Ukraine. He'd been in Ukraine less than 2 months, got captured on a checkpoint, never done time in the military, was grossly overweight, had type 1 diabetes. You know, he was in the wrong place, wrong time, wrong build, not trained fit. which is why I use him as a not to talk ill of him, but to talk positively about what you shouldn't do in captivity. And
Right.
I'll leave it there with him. But he was, you know, a really generally good guy. He was the guy that told me that the Moskva, you know, because when I was captured, the speed of what was going on,
Yeah,
it was
you
going
didn't know
so
what had happened
quickly.
on the outside world.
Didn't know what happened. So he came in when he was captured, 2 weeks. It took me a week to get really the courage to talk to him. And he just said, no, mate, the Moskva, you know, we sunk it. And I was like, whoa, what, really? He said, nah, they're fighting back. They're pushing back. And I was like,
Hmm.
there's loads of people at the border trying to get in. And I was like,
The
holy
the
shit,
fact that
you know.
he had a recognizable voice. Let me put like, it's not a Russian voice. It's not an ambiguous somewhere else voice. It's a voice you can relate to. Um, we do know that you had people like Graham Phillips and John Mark Dougan and other English speakers there.
Mm.
Isn't it true that they could just have easily had someone like that who was not a public figure enough to come in and play the Mutt and Jeff or good cop bad cop thing?
Yeah, we were conscious, especially of Ukrainians that could be in there who could speak English, that whether they were English or whether they were plants. I mean, we had to be careful. But I mean, at the black site for the first 60 days, uh, it was very difficult because there was only me in an isolation cell for a brief
Right.
time, couple of weeks. And then I was transferred into a cell, which was a similar size cell. It was like a broom cupboard. Imagine
Hmm.
living in a
Hmm.
broom cupboard for 2 months and just being given bread slid through the door every day now and again, not knowing whether it'll turn up the next day. Then you get some sort of idea with two other people in that broom cupboard. And if you lie
Right.
down, you can't even lie down all three of you together because it's not wide enough to put you all three of you in. So it's very difficult to really um, slide in an operative. Well, I was worried about there was cameras in there as well watching us 24/7. So we didn't know if those
Hmm.
cameras were mics. So we had to be very difficult, you know, very controlled in what we talked about because
Right.
you don't know
Right.
whether they're listening. But generally, I think, yeah, when we moved to the second prison shortly before the trial, then yeah, we started to really see because it's very easy to see the abnormal in the normal in a prison because the same thing happens every day.
Right. Right.
You know, you wake up, you go to sleep in the same place, and you're doing it every day for 2 months underground. I didn't see the sun unless I was being pulled out to talk to the prosecutor or getting interrogated. So for 2 months, I didn't even see the sun. You're just living underground,
And now
wondering
that
if
you've
anybody knows where you are.
and now that you've compared it to what captured Russians go through, you said before that they wanted to talk to you because they wanted to know what your experiences had been, right?
Yeah.
And
Well, they did.
night and fucking day, by the way.
It is. I mean, you can't. You've got to take into consideration. You can't. You don't know the Russian prisoner's journey from the point he was captured to the point he's just met you. So
Right.
under the Geneva Conventions, I have to be very careful in what I say to him, how I project it, how I talk to him. Certainly, if I'm going to record him, I've got to keep his name, identity a secret.
Hmm.
So I can't sort of make insinuations, but certainly, I mean, if a Russian's captured, he's going to go through some shit at the start. They want to, you know, Ukrainians are going to want to know who he is. Are they all reputable? Probably not. The
Right.
difference between Russian interrogations, Russians' brutality, is that it's systemic within the Russian, uh, you know,
It's the playbook. I mean,
it's the
it's
playbook.
not like I did a lot of the work as a journalist. My first step into this world was looking at what happened with Abu Ghraib, what happened at the black sites in Thailand, and then being as condemning as I was of those activities, is it what happened with everyone who does that kind of job? So we'll take it in two categories. Abu Ghraib being essentially prisoners held to keep them from being in combat and or accountability. Uh, example B, the black sites in Thailand were to force confessions from those that had been captured and distilled for further interrogation all the way up to Abu Zubaydah Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. Now, but what was the official protocol? Always, or at least within modern measurable memory. That's what made the black site thing with Cheney and all those guys overseeing it the anomaly. Still,
It
as,
is.
as cynical as I could be about the other things the United States government did in those 20 years, but not with the Russians. The Russians is pretty fucking clear, whether it's the soldiers or the civilians, they're a playbook. And then when it comes to the soldiers, um, Marines have said Azov gets it worse than the others, and everyone's getting it terrible.
I disagree. To be fair, I was a Brit, and I always thought spies
You
were
make a
bad.
point that being Brit or being an American might
Yeah.
be also an additional flavor. But
Nyomnik is like worse than spy. Nyomnik is like mercenary in Russian. So
okay,
you
yeah,
literally, I think you could probably be a little bit worse. So
right. But I'm
I
just
mean,
saying is that the Marines, the Ukrainian Marines I've talked
yeah,
to
probably,
in
yeah.
multiple groups have said, yeah, what they did to me terrible, man. But you should
The
see
Azov
what they do
guys
to
do get it.
Azov guys, and
Yeah, I like I don't
it's
think they got it
protocol.
any worse than the Brits, to be fair. I mean, even I was speaking to my colleagues who were told that we were killed, and when they were
Right.
released 3 years later, we're going, shit, we thought you were dead.
Yeah, we were told you were dead.
We
Yeah.
knew you were gonna we knew you were gonna get killed because we just knew the Russians what they'd do to you, and we was like I was hanging on, but I mean, we've got to go back. When I met the Russians in their prison, they were in a United Nations Red Cross, Geneva Convention style prison with a shop, football. I don't know how their route to that. I don't know what's gone. I can't verify that. So we've got to be conscious of that. They could have gone through some shit from someone.
Mm-hmm.
So I went there, and war crimes are war crimes. I don't believe in any of it. Essentially, but yeah, it's systemic. I never saw anything like that prison I went to. And there were 5 other prisons where they go through. That's the end point for those Russians. What they went through before that, I can't vouch for that.
Ukrainians I know who get in that the blue flag droppers is what one friend called himself. In other words, like where the pickup points are for the fallen, and he talked about captures, and he says, you want to hit them upside the head. You've been through so much shit, and the fact that we don't, fuck them. And it's some way in which he distills that every time we've ever talked about what it's like in that area, because he's one of the ones who's required to get them from captured at the battlefield to get them the fuck out of the theater of operations. And he's very clear. You want to fucking hit him in the head because all the shit that's happened. But the fact that I don't means when he sits down and calls his fucking
got to be
mom,
better. You have to be better.
Yeah,
that was the whole idea. We did the documentary was we had to be better. We couldn't talk to them the way that we were treated. We couldn't treat them the way we were treated. We actually helped one of the guys in the video we did. Got Brahim. He was Arabic, and we got Brahim to ring his mum because he asked us to ring his parents because he didn't know if they knew where he was, and we did. And Brahim rang them and said, your son's in a prison in Ukraine. And she was like, thank God, I didn't know where he was. The Russians haven't even contacted us. That opened up a whole new spectrum for us, really, about, what does go on with the foreign fighters. How are they recruited? The contracts they're getting. Why doesn't his mum know? He's been fighting. He's been in Russia and on the front for 8 months. Why doesn't she know that he's in Ukrainian prison?
And the entire time you were
great. They allowed this to.
Sorry.
Yeah. We asked permission and said, look, can we ring his mum? And they said, yeah, because he will get a call, but it's in a list and a long list, and it's a system here. You can't just go and make a phone call when somebody sort of says prison, clue in a name. So you can't just go and do it. I never had any of that. I never had a way that I could ring my parents without being supervised. I wasn't being told that if I didn't say what they wanted me to say, that they would use a pair of bolt croppers to cut off my finger. I didn't have the choice when I was thrown in front of RT Russia Today, in front of a Western accented journalist, Roman Kazarev, and told, you're going to speak to him. And he comes along and just sort of says, so you're a bit of a Nazi, aren't you? And you're going, no, I'm not a Nazi, no. He's trying to get the justification and the narrative for tomorrow for Russia. He's not coming as an impartial journalist. He's trying to set you up and portray you to a Russian nation that there's a reason why we're doing it, because he's a Nazi. And, anyone that knows me, I'm not a Nazi. I'm not a terrorist. I never left a country I had legal status in. But they don't mention that. They don't mention anything like that. Whereas these guys, they do go out for interviews. They get paid. They can do work. They can bake bread. They can do things to keep their mind active. They've got a mailbox. They can write home. I wasn't even given the rights to go and see humanitarian aid worker or Red Cross. Or, we didn't get a toothbrush for 2 months.
And in fact, the defender families here that are waiting for the Ukrainian defenders to be released have complained that Ukraine went so far above the line that there was actually latitude to go reduce offerings of.
I don't know about that. I think the Geneva Conventions means that Russia, they were promised all these riches. Russia's taken these guys in. They're lucky. I'm
saying that the Ukrainian side treats Russian captivities. Oh, go ahead. Yeah, fair.
Yeah, I'll get to that point. So they're lucky to be alive. When I got there, they were still complaining. So going back to your point about why they were interested in me, I was with journalists. They weren't too particularly interested in talking to journalists. But what became apparent was when I told them actually me and Aidan were in captivity in Russia, we started talking to them. They got a bit confident. They were really interested. So what did you think about it? And I was talking to this Wagner guy going, so what made you fight in Russia? And he sort of said, well, I was in a Russian prison for murder. And I said, I was in a Russian prison too. So we started talking and he sort of sat there and went, what did you think? And I went, it was shit. I said, I'd probably done the same thing as you'd done. If he was inside, I'd have probably wanted to get out and join the military. So already I'm sitting there bonding with a guy from Wagner's coming to Ukraine going, man, you've got a life expectancy of 5 years. I'd have probably done the same thing if I was him. I wouldn't have murdered anybody in the first place. But do you know what I mean? I would have probably done the same thing as him. What we realized was that in the prison as well, that generally money isn't the main driver for these people, especially these foreign fighters. Some do come. We met a couple of professional soldiers from Africa, but the majority were guys that were just trying to get out of places like Mogadishu and real slums. And generally, they don't know anything about the money. They just want a ticket to Russia or a visa somewhere where they can sort of better their life and start fresh and maybe get a job. They don't know anything at that point. So there's a lot of criminal gangs working in places like Africa, taking these guys out of these poorest places who can afford to maybe pay some money to get them to a country like Kenya, where there's a Russian consulate and a Russian embassy, and then they can get speed track through on a visa to Russia. So there is an element of that and a criminal underworld that's funding trafficking these guys to Russia to essentially bring them to Russia under false pretenses, relax visa laws, knowing full well that they'll probably overstay, go down the illegal routes, they threaten them and say, look, if you don't join the military, we're going to send you back to Mogadishu, and the very place they don't want to go. So essentially, they join the military.
Yeah, there was a bait and switch on a lot of those guys that testified that I had. I told you before, I went to one of these, coordination headquarters, access opportunities, and I did listen to each country as, like, for instance, the Nepalese. What did the Nepalese say? How does it match the other Nepalese fighters? The Africans. There was 3 guys from Africa. 2 guys from Cuba and Central America, and they did have some unique sounds in the sense of what they were saying relates to the country they came from. And I asked Petro and the others that are on the coordination headquarters staff, what do you do when you have one of these captured Russian mercenaries that is from a country that has autocratic, basically domestic terrorism law policies against their own people? You're not going to just send them back to death. because Ukrainians are civilized. So what are you doing? What are you going to do with them? You know, and they said it's a very difficult situation when we
They're
have guys
uncertain.
recaptured. Yeah,
Yeah, absolutely. They're uncertain about. If a lot of them go back, they'll go back to prison, which is why I'm not. When I went there, prison is still prison. It might have a shop. It might have places where you can work and go and
right,
play a bit of football. But prison is still generally prison. If anyone's saying they're living a life of luxury, I'd be like, no, because
right,
they probably won't go back to Russia. Russia's got no interest in exchanging these guys because, one, the prisons are better. They'll go back to their countries and go, we were treated far better over the other side than we were here. The
right,
realities of war will be probably stop the migration of foreign fighters eventually anyway, because of how many of them that are dying on the front lines, not even before they even get to see an enemy trench. So generally, I think it's not they're not living in the Ritz-Carlton. I'll tell you that now.
right.
It's very prison is still prison. You can't go home, you can't do anything. And if they don't get exchanged and this war stops and Putin doesn't accept them back, the chances are they've got a choice then. They'll have to either stay in Ukraine or go back to their country of origin, which most of them will probably end up when this war stops, if it doesn't end soon. After 4 or 5 years, 6 years, I can't remember how it is. I think somebody said 7 years, and then they'll end up having to have a choice of you can stay in Ukraine and work, or you can go back to your home country. They'll just serve
Hmm.
their time. So they've just got to sit there for in this prison for 7 years. And I would love to see somebody spend a month in the prison before they lose their shit,
Yeah.
because it's not. You need those things to keep your mind active, to keep you sane. And we have to be better. We have to be better than the Russians at that.
And I asked you when we did spaces on this, I think it was the first one you and I ever did on the topic, and I have all the audio of those conversations. Um, and I asked you, were there strategies both for yourself and someone like I kind of know your personality pretty well, someone you're looking after that you got to help through, who maybe it's breaking them or something. Were there strategies by which day in day out you kept focus and or something to keep your mind from entering the brain fuckery?
Yeah, that comes a lot down to character.
Hmm.
At the end of the day, there is a degree of character. You can train people, but character really ultimately takes over.
Hmm.
I'm a little bit older. I've seen a bit of the world. You know, for me, because of the age, a lot of people have different faces, but are generally the same characters. You can spot the comedian, the thug, the brainy
Hmm.
guy, the stuff like. So generally, for me, talking to people, I actually, as weird as it sounds, I'd had a few laughs with interrogators, bonded with them.
Mm.
You talk to make that bond. I was actually, when they decided that I wasn't important enough to carry on any sort of talks and stuff, I was lost. I was then left in a cell. So you get two different sorts of pressures. You get system-induced pressures, which
Hmm.
are the beatings, the punches, the electrocutions, and the things that are over quite quickly, but you can mitigate for, you can do that keep you active, especially at the start of captivity. So then, when everything's died down, you then got the self-induced pressures, which could be far worse. If you let your brain wander, because one of the times I really did struggle was when I'd put this stiff upper lip. I'd had capture training. I couldn't tell anybody. If I left, they would interrogate the guys in my cell to find out what they could find out about me. So I couldn't
Right,
tell anybody I had any training, but
right,
they were starting to ask questions. How do you know all this stuff? What do you think is going to happen next? Suddenly you become a leader, and a leader in a group of people is the worst thing you want to be. So I wasn't then trying to be the grey man. I was trying to make myself not become a leader and stand out in a group of people to get, hold on a minute, here's a problem, or
right,
he's in
right,
charge of them, or because otherwise I'm going to get more crap. So, but you end up taking that mantle on because you obviously know far more than the other people you're in the prison with, and you can anticipate what's going on and what's happening and the different stages and what's coming next. And you
right.
can tell people, look, if Putin walks in, because here's a story. So I was in Makiivka prison, Devon Sim, 97, and
Right.
it was shortly after the bomb blast. Was it Olenivka? Um,
And that was July 2022, July 19th.
yeah, they got
No,
shipped to our prison.
July 29th, 2022.
So they blew up there, and we got wind that Steven Seagal and Putin could be coming to Makiivka from one of the guards. And
Right,
in a
right.
quite a surreal moment, I was like going, guys, has anybody had any press training? They went, no. And I was like, they were shitting themselves that Putin might come in, and I said, listen, dudes, and suddenly I found myself going, there's nothing you could do about this. It's going to be edited. It's going to be stuff like that. Don't worry too much about it. Just keep low, look miserable. Don't really say anything unless you have to. I was just getting a bit of coaching before just something, Steven Seagal came through the door and started talking to us about bombs going off at Olenivka. So, it's quite surreal moments like that where we were sitting there sort of thinking, are we ever going to get out of this? But when they went to court, I just broke down because I'd put on this such stiff upper lip and this fight back and how we were going to get out of this. And we're going to give it to the system and keep going. By the time they went to court and I was left in the cell for about 12 or 13 hours on my own, I just flipping let it all out. Am I going to get home? What am I doing? I could die tomorrow. I'd already been sentenced to death by then. So I was just venting, which was probably a good thing in a way. But
Sure.
the things I was doing to keep my mind, I never really thought of home much. I was thinking about where can I not get a beating? Where can I get my next bit of food? What's going to happen with a court case? But when you get left in a cell for like 24 hours, 23 hours a day, occasionally you might go out for a walk. Paul Urey's just been beaten to death next door. And you're sitting there for the next 4 months in that same place where you can't go out, you can't do anything. You're stuck there with no reading material, apart from eventually we negotiated a dictionary, The Great Gatsby, and The Chamber of Secrets, Harry Potter, were the only English books in the library. I tell you what, that long room where he gets the everlasting plate of sandwiches, when she goes into detail about the food on that long haul, I must have read that passage over and over again, licking my lips, going, "Oh, sausages! Oh, everlasting!" I was so hungry at that point. I'd have eaten a scabby horse because that no food raises your energy levels, it drops them, it creates mood swings. Food then becomes a commodity, extremely dangerous in the prison when people haven't got it. And the prison guards are constantly trying to agitate you because they're undermanned. They want the friction between other prisoners, not on them. So they're constantly giving people tellies, other people tellies, trying to shift the idea of that somebody could be talking, the other person is not.
Yeah, this has been a very unfortunate thing that when captive Ukrainian defenders come home, there are comments made by families that are waiting and or other defenders, and I've tried to tell other journalists be very careful at entering that conversation easily because you have a series of pains all at play at once. And the
Yeah.
job of a journalist is not to fall into the orbit of any one of them. You could be as sympathetic as you can, but to be a professional, you've got to keep the difference between how you feel about what just got told to you. And I'll give you an example for the viewers. Did you see this guy who came home? Especially if you're reading only Ukrainian language circles about this, man, that's the motherfucker who was, and insert whatever the accusation is. Now, in an ideal world, what was said would come home, and because I'm not questioning that person's authenticity, I know they are telling what they believe to be the truth. But I know that the Russians have also, like you just said so perfectly, have set up scenarios where they're led to believe all sorts of shit.
Yeah, Aiden was beaten by a woman, another prisoner woman, because it's
Yeah,
degrading and they don't like it.
yeah,
Well,
yeah,
he's guys. They do all that sort of stuff. There's no.
right.
And I was tortured right up until the very end as well, as what I tell people. These guys I saw, the Russians at the Ukrainian prison, were in what we call a 5-star Hilton hotel for prisons, really, compared to what I was in. who are just going through the motions until they go home, with all the trappings of a well-organised Red Cross prisoner of war camp. There's tools lying around for them to work, knives, stuff like that.
Right.
So it's not like they just want to go home. Where my last day before I didn't even know I was being exchanged. I was beaten to a pulp. I had scars on here where I was bleeding from my eyes. I literally had scar on my back when I got home. We took pictures of my first day after my exchange where I was literally through the restraints, bleeding on my wrists. I had baton marks here, bleeding from my eye, all the way through starvation and beatings, all the way through to the very end. That ain't happening to them. None of that. So
exactly.
Whatever, and they've got access to Red Cross, and they're being interviewed by the Red Cross, and if they have grievances, they can say. Some of these guys were still complaining. The food shit. Well, they're the guys making the food. They've got cooks, they can work, they can earn money, they can spend stuff at the shop, still moaning.
Right.
And there's, like you just said, you can't show that. I can't sit there and go, are you fucking kidding me, pal?
Right.
I can't bloody say that, and I was like, do you know what I was in? But some of the prisoners, like the Wagner guy, would tell me, he would go, you know what Russian prisons are like. What would you have done? And I'm like, yeah, I totally agree. I'd have done exactly what you'd have done. I would have gone into the army and tried to get out and survive, and I did. So it is a cruel world. And when I talk about it now, people go, I had no idea.
Right.
And you go, you don't, because
I've been reading some of the comments while we're talking. It's one of the things I've been doing here is reading what some of the people's reaction are, and some of these folks have watched you speak before already, but they're hearing it, and I'm your friend, so my blood is boiling just hearing it, and I've heard this before, not with the nuances, but I it still makes my fucking blood boil that they did this to you and the guys.
I'm
And
never
also,
going to be the victim in this, is another thing I say to you. You'd asked
amen.
that question at the start, brother. What can people take? Don't ever be a victim. This is a massive learning thing for me, because I said to you at the start, you never know how you're going to handle something like this until you're in it. And one of the things I always tell soldiers now is, if you're going to survive and your brain's going to get away from there, you've got to hold your head up high and say, I did a good job.
Right.
And if that means dying in the process, because I'm not saying I'm not going to tell them anything, and you get beaten. You can't, somebody wants to kill you, there's not much you can do about it in captivity. It's going to happen. But you can mitigate the circumstances by listening to what I'm going to tell you. And one of them is, don't ever be the victim. You've got to hold your head up high and say, I did a really good job, if you're ever going to leave that place. I am so proud of what we did. I've told you before. But for those, I'm so proud. We stand firm. We held in Mariupol for 7 weeks until we ran out of weapons and ammunition and food and water. Exactly. We then got captured all right on trying to get away. We then survived captivity for another 7 months, being beaten, tortured. And I came out with still my digits, my fingers, my ears. I survived. And I didn't quit. I didn't stop. In the court, when they gave him a death penalty, I was so pissed off, Chris. I was so flipping pissed off that we didn't get our voice. You see the pictures, I was so angry. I wasn't like submissive. The judge had to go at me in the trial because I was so vocal. I was so angry when we got literally the death penalty. I knew it was coming. We all knew it was coming. But that's a big propaganda stunt. But now I look at it and you watch, they've just jailed the Crocus massacre guys again. So I'm able to understand what prisons are like. I don't know if they did it or not. But what I do know is they were rounded up in less than 12 hours after the incident. There's one of them had his ear cut off. One of them was electrocuted on his testicles. One guy they wheeled into the pre-trial unconscious. So the chances that they did it are probably pretty slim. They probably rounded up the first lot of immigrants and just subdued the masses and said, we've caught the Crocus Day massacre guys. Yet there's footage now pinging, maybe FSB were involved in this to turn the tide, similar to the bombings, So there's questions starting to be asked whether it was actually them or whether it was, intelligence services in Russia
It's
that
one
did it.
reasons why I believe that at least that it came off as the appearance of what it was. I was actually covering we had a huge salvo of missiles here across that country, across here in Ukraine, before that Saturday when that happened. And one thing that stood out was um, Russians had been abusing Tajiks for a long time and Dagestanis, but
Mm.
Tajiks in particular had been really abusing them. So there is a really robust history between these communities and the way in which the FSB treats Tajiks. So the let it happen scenario exists. Um, but, my theory was that they had, in the case of Crocus Music Hall attack, was that they had let their vulnerabilities go unchecked. That's why such an attack that was so yesteryear was suddenly real. Because it's just as bad in a way. You're
It
so
is.
busy killing Ukrainians that you can't take care of your home front security.
And the worst thing about it is they video it all. So all those guys, before they'd even got to a pre-trial, were tortured to bits. And Russians
You
don't
can't tell
torture like you
anything
see on
after
the
that.
movie.
Exactly. Fuck.
Because they don't. Torture's not used like you see on in the movies where it's like tell us what you know or we'll electrocute you. Torture isn't used like that. What torture's really good and what the Russians use it for is getting you to admit to places you haven't been and things you
Hmm.
haven't done.
Hmm.
Exactly what they've probably done to them. So by
Right.
the end of it, you've had your ear cut off, you've had your testicles electrocuted, and you're gonna go, yeah, I did it just to make the pain stop.
Hmm.
So, of course, eventually the same, very similar situation to me. I was electrocuted,
Yeah.
tortured, stabbed in the leg, beaten, and then I was put onto trial where I was classed as a Nazi and a mercenary terrorist, told in the trial that I couldn't say not guilty with Aiden, that we had to say guilty, and then given the
Hmm.
death penalty in the show trial that essentially is recognised in Russia now. And we talked about it. Now they're abusing it. I'm an extremist now. I never left the
Right.
country. I had flipping legal status in. You invaded. It's
Right.
like I don't get it, but you can because I use that now as a positive. I'm able to understand the Russian system. I wouldn't say judicial system. It has a
Sure.
judicial system, but nothing that we would associate with justice. So it's bizarre because so now I mean I tell another aspect of it is you just turn something into a positive. I was never going to be the victim. What it's
Right.
done is give me a great understanding of the Russian spy world, the narrative propaganda from a position, I never thought I'd ever be in. That now makes me a positive expert in the field that I was trained in because, most SERE schools are done by theorists. All the instructors have never been captured, but they teach it. So,
Right.
it's great. I'm one of a handful of people that have gone through SERE training, been captured by the Russians and came out the other side. So
Hmm.
it gives me I was never going to be the victim in this. I was always going to use that, give that back to the military. I help talk to Americans, Swedes, Norwegians, Brits, anybody that really invites me to come and talk about resistance and capture and what it's like to be captured and giving the best chance of survival for those that might end up in the same position. And now we're trying to do the same thing for Ukrainians who don't have any, a
And
SEER or a training
you
here.
gave invaluable wisdom that I mentioned this to the other day on the phone when I asked you what would I say to Tetiana Chuganova about her son, words of wisdom, and you said tell her to go take care of herself, go for a walk, go swimming. To remember, he's a Marine. He's trained
He's
to
a
come
Marie.
through. If he comes home to his mom broken, his wife, sister, whoever it would be, whichever category broken. Sorry, I got Mark Hamill in my ear. Um, I'm trying to concentrate on you guys, and I've got Mark Hamill. Careful, careful. Everything's going to be bad.
Yeah.
Um, but I use that information to not only directly tell her what you said, but to empower my working relationship with her, so that when I would ask or we would talk about where things are at. I would always ask her like, are you doing as we said, where you go swimming or whatever therapeutic action for her was. And that's been an invaluable a bit of wisdom that you shared, just so you know. And
It
I want to
is.
say that with our viewers, that I pass it on to more than one person, including recently. And it's really hard when you have like some of the cases now. I mean, for me, they're kind of emotional because these are my friends,
Mm.
who are waiting, like Sophia, who was the young wife who has no idea the status of her husband, not even at captured state. It's one of these new 5-month-old cases, And the
That's
first
all.
thing I
That is
said,
hard. Yeah.
yeah, and I said the first thing I said is, if there's one thing I've learned, take care of yourself.
Yeah. If you don't take care of yourself, you're not going to see the person come
Because we
back
have
if
a
they
few
do
cases
wander in
where the
through the door.
family members, yeah, we have a few cases where the family members broke waiting
It
indefinitely.
happens.
Yeah.
But
So,
that's what I say to people now. Don't be scared of even prisoners. They say don't cry. Don't be scared of letting it all out.
yeah.
Because what we don't want you to do is let it all out when you're randomly filling your car with petrol, or
Right. Right.
just go down. Because that's not a time to. You shouldn't be getting emotional at times like that when you're doing that. When you're
Yeah.
thinking about it, maybe. When you're talking about it, definitely.
Right.
You're going to get times where you know, you are going to talk about, like I've just done now. I did a talk in Canada and broke down weirdly talking about it. I'd never done it before, and I'd never done it since. But weirdly, something snapped in me where I talked about this specific thing and got
Yeah.
really upset about it. But I didn't get embarrassed or anything. I was like, well, it's natural. I'm talking about the very thing
Well, like for me,
that's
I'm
it's
thinking
good, and that's
about when
good.
I asked, yeah, in my role of doing journalism around this, when I've asked, I haven't seen so and so, meaning it was a wife in this example that I was thinking of a minute ago. And it was like, I haven't seen her, can someone, say, one, how's she doing, if you know? Oh yeah, she's down in the Carpathians right now. Oh yeah. Yeah, she had a big break because her husband's still in captivity. His dad died in the middle of all this, so he wouldn't know when he's coming out, and it just popped for her. It was one too many straws that were crumbling underneath her. And I, like with
It's
many
good. It's good.
cases, not knowing what happened to her for a while was traumatic, because the only thing I heard was, she was at least one that could make it through. Now she's alive. I do know that. But there are some of the family members that don't make it in that
You
capacity.
don't. And you've got to remember, these prisoners, when they're captured, their life pauses. They think everything when they're captured is still like it
Yeah.
was when they were captured. So those guys that are being released 3 years later, they're in their head, it's exactly like what it was when they left. The
Right.
chances are some of those guys are coming back to their villages being totally obliterated. They're not there anymore. Some of those guys,
Yeah.
like my auntie died while I was in
Berdyansk,
captivity.
Berdyansk, family residents of all those Marines. They're not going back to
Just
Berdyansk anytime soon.
yeah, a lot of the guys I was fighting with Mariupol was they were struck were living in Kherson, so they were fighting in Mariupol, knowing that their
Right.
loved ones had just been occupied in Kherson and still carrying on.
Right.
So when they come out, the first thing they want to know, every prisoner wants to know, is what's happened, where we're at, who made it out, who didn't,
Yeah.
and if your family members are broken as you come out, that's just going to end up with more problems for those guys
My friend
coming back
Hamzat,
into it.
his wife died in the war, and he found out when he got released.
Yeah, it's awful. Yeah.
He didn't know until she got released, and we should plan to do an interview with him, because I have some communications, but we haven't got to an interview. Some other in the Ukrainian news sphere, some of these guys get pretty good interviews, in the sense that cathartic news comes out for them, and within
Yeah.
the Ukrainian language sphere, their story gets known, but they're not heard of in the West on these stories. And I know that you and I talk about making sure there's a bright,
That's why it's important writing a book
yeah,
and talking about it and doing all
yeah.
that stuff.
We have a lot of defenders still in captivity. What do you think that these viewers here tonight should be contemplating before, um, next week's show or in the future, so that we have short-term action goals, so that they don't just hope in the sky that happens? What do you think they should be thinking about?
That's a good deep
takeaways.
question. I mean, they should
Yeah.
be, people really are normally inspired by just what I've just talked about, like what we're doing, and go and tell friends and keep it in the public eye. And they have
Yeah.
to really, hopefully, with what we do in the media and what we talk about now, gets people. It's not the 60 people that are on here now and me and you talking that's the
Sure.
important thing. The ripple effect is what's really important. Though, so 60 on here, go and tell one other person. That's another 60. They may get
Right.
half of them may tell another lot of people about the podcast, and they go and tell another lot. And then suddenly you've got 100, 200 people. I talked to 200 people in the Isle of Man over the weekend. So
Right.
I said the same thing to them. It's not who I'm talking to here over 2 days. It's who you go and talk to after about, I just went in
Yeah.
there and heard that story. And that's
Right.
crazy shit, and he told this and he said this and they've been done that. That's where you start to get Ukraine back in the public eye and people understand a bit more about it.
Yeah, and some of these viewers that we have that were, you're the expats of Twitter,
Yeah.
uh, you smart people, and you moved elsewhere. I can say from the DMs that I've gotten for the last year and a half that there are people who became more in tune with the Defender stories than they would have if not for, and I'll take some credit, people like me who said, it's
Yeah.
the story. By the way, yeah, it's the fucking story. Yeah. By the way, yeah, it's the fucking story. Why? Don't tell me you care about soldiers unless you only care about them if they're not in captivity.
It's
You know?
Nazi style concentration camps we haven't seen since World War II. And they're
Right.
done by the very people that are calling us the Nazis. They've
Right.
set up filtration camps in the east of Ukraine, and they're everything from kids to civilians to women to soldiers are abused in these camps, filtration camps.
Right.
And they're so abused that they can't do anything. Now their internet's taken, social media, there'll be a communications icon. This is the very things we were seeing the Nazis do in World War II. So I have to use this way of describing it to get people interested in newspapers and talk to about. And people are astonished that this is still going on.
Yeah.
2000 and whatever we are now, 2026. You've still got Nazi-style filtration camps. You've still got torture. You've still got people being stabbed in the leg, kids being stolen. You've still got it's still here. It's not gone anywhere. So that's where you get the shock of it. Russia did
Yeah.
such an amazing PR job before the invasion by convincing people we were Nazis, and they're doing the very thing that they hated the most. They're actually, and now the worst thing I think is that they didn't take Kiev. They're not winning this war because now those war crimes will eventually, and all those people involved in it and what they've done in the east of Ukraine and all the genocide they're committing there and all the people they've killed and stolen properties off,
That's right.
that's going to come back on them at some point because they didn't win this war.
Amen to that. And
Mm.
I can say this to our viewers here tonight. You and I have said this before. Time is life, and you know, it still hurts that my friend
Thanks, Dan.
and my friend Anastasia gets her dad home. Anastasia Savova gets her dad home, a 36 Marine, by the way. And Alexandra comes home, and I was very happy for her. And Alexandra's condition was so bad by the time he came home. He was only able to be in her life a few more months before he died in October. And
It's bad.
and there's so many more cases that we don't even get a chance to talk to. I'm hoping we can get some of our Olenivka community friends to come on this platform, and I've hooked them up with other journalists to say, what happens to the folks that have had, loved ones who were seriously hurt in Olenivka massacre in July 2022, as we now enter 2026.
Yeah.
That they still are in captivity. They're still unaware of their actual physical condition, and so we have to do more. So
I don't know what the long-term effects are. I'm still. You saw the statement
yeah.
when it came out. I was like 60 kilos and really in a bad way. But touch wood, I'm still all right. So I'm going to run out. I'm 20% battery. I'm just letting you know because if it did
Yeah.
run
We're gonna
out,
go actually for our viewers, and this is an all Ukraine night. We're not switching gears back to America. Sorry, guys. But actually, I'm gonna drop this space out. Everyone who's watching now, I'm asking you stick around because you're gonna see me reboot, and we'll have my friend, our friend Aziza, will join us, and we're going to talk about her creative work and speaking for Crimea. And do not miss the interview we did just a couple of days with our other Moya Podruha,
thank you
Lenia
for everyone as well.
Umorova, who was here, and her words about living in captivity and time in captivity as a civilian. So, but tonight, thank you, brother, and
And
everyone,
you,
just
mate.
come back and join us and give me about 10
And if
minutes.
anybody's interested, watch Captivity or Captured on my on
Absolutely.
the
I'm so glad you
documentary
did
that
that.
me and Aidan Aslin did, because that'll give you a better understanding of what it's like. And if you haven't seen it, watch Captured. It's my first documentary, and I think I'll probably do another one soon. So, but yeah, great. Thanks for having me on again.
I'm thankful
And
for you. No, thank you, brother. Thank you for this. And I will be, I keep getting narrated in my ears. I will be at the front next week. So that's why tonight, catch our program that will start here in just a few more minutes with Aziza, because all next week will not be interviews like we normally say. We'll do something. I'll come say hi, but I'm going to be where too many crazy shit things happen.
yeah,
So, so you and I will pay attention to what's happening, and well, of course, we will keep our
we'll see
same bad
everybody
time
next Friday.
for Friday next week at 9 o'clock.
Yeah, look
Charge your
forward to it.
batteries.
And I'll be in.
See you soon.
Hopefully, I'll be in Ukraine again. So that'd be cool.
You got, man, get back here, homie. It
I'm
just feels
trying. I'm
different.
trying.
I keep thinking, yeah, he's still in the UK. See
I'm
you,
looking
man.
like it. It's light. I got a little bit of blood pressure or something. Look, I'm getting a bit hot.
Yeah, I had to turn the brights down because they're killing my eyes tonight. I've been working all day. Been up since 6 o'clock. We went to interview Mikola Melnick, which the interview will come out soon, and some others, to get done. So
See you later, everybody. I'll let you get on to your next one. Catch you in a
see ya,
bit.
brother. Thank
See
you.
you, brother. See you, everybody. Goodbye.
And you guys
And,
know how it
thanks,
works.
Tone. Yeah, Tone. I'll Norway. Get in contact with me.
There
See
you
you
go.
later. Bye bye.
Slava, as we say, Slava Ukraini Heroim Slava.
Героям слава.
И пиздец Российской
Slava
Федерации.
нации.
Смерть ворогам.